Hello and welcome to GameSack. Sony, as you know, is the maker of the PlayStation line of consoles, as well as many of the games for them. They also make, electronics and stuff. And as you probably know, Sony was trying to get in with Nintendo to make a CD-ROM for the Super NES, but that deal went sour. But did you know that Sony published a ton of games for several different consoles before the PlayStation? It started out as a subsidiary with CBS known as CSG Imagesoft and was later known as Sony Imagesoft. So let's take a look at all of their games in roughly chronological order. Super Dodgeball on the NES was Sony's first release in June of 1989 as CSG Imagesoft. It was developed by Technosoft Japan and was actually released in North America first. Up to 2 players can compete in a game of dodgeball, but 4 players can play in the Famicom version. Your goal is to reduce the life bars of the 3 main members of the opposing team. It's fun, but the NES really struggles with this game, as you can see by the extremely choppy nature of it, as well as the great abundance of flicker. If you can get used to that, this can be a fun one, especially with a friend. Solstice on the NES was next, but it was only released by Sony in North America. Nintendo did it themselves in Europe. This is one of those isometric puzzle games. I recall that it was decently popular in its time. The princess has been kidnapped, which is rather inconvenient for you and your mighty beard. You use your wits to get through each room, grab items, better powers, and so on. It really helps if you hold your controller diagonally in this one so that the D-pad corresponds to the actual direction that you're pressing. The music by Tim Follin is quite good. Then came the exciting Dragon's Lair. Just kidding, it's not very exciting at all. This was an attempt to port the Don Bluth cartoon arcade game to the confines of an 8-bit console. They were pretty much relying on name recognition alone for this one. The controls feel very slow, and the jump and action buttons are reversed because the developers didn't realize the standard that Super Mario Bros. Had already set. Like the arcade, this one requires a lot of level and pattern memorization. Once you learn all of this, it becomes, well, surprisingly not as bad as it looks. Here's Hudson Hawk on the NES, and it's the first game we're covering today that has the actual Sony branding as part of the Imagesoft logo. In this one, you play as a badly sunburned Bruce Willis based on the 1991 movie that very few people saw. You're armed with an unlimited amount of baseballs and impeded by very poorly designed controls. The levels are based on extreme memorization, and they can be very frustrating at first as things like crates just bounce off of you. The game can actually be almost enjoyable once you learn all of the levels, but that control will be tormenting you the entire way. It also came out on the Game Boy. This one plays a lot better. It's still a touch awkward here and there, but all in all, it's still the more enjoyable version of the game that feels like it had more thought put into the controls and level design. This is Altered Space, a 3D alien adventure. Well, actually it's Solstice, but with a sci-fi slant to it. Sadly, there's nothing 3D about this. It's just isometric, which isn't as exciting. It's tough to hold your Game Boy diagonally for the controls to work well, but you can do it if you're playing on a non-Game Boy device. It basically works the same way as Solstice, collecting items and figuring your way through each room. Here's Smart Ball on the Super NES, developed by Game Freak. You play as Jerry, and in Japan this is called Jerry Boy. In the US version you're supposed to be a ball, but come on, he's slime, or jelly if you will. Your goal is to make it to the goal. You can collect balls to throw, but you defeat most enemies by knocking them out from below or crushing them from above. You can also stick to walls and ceilings, and hell, even collect letters to spell your name, which is pretty darn exciting. The controls are quite awkward at first and definitely take a while to get used to, but it's decently enjoyable after that. They were actually making a sequel called Jerry Boy 2, which unfortunately never got released. That's too bad because this one is so much better than the first. They ironed out the controls and as a result, it's pretty fun. Here's Soccer Mania for the Game Boy. This is a very slow-moving game of soccer that's meant for kids if the simple music is anything to go by. It has link cable functionality for 2 players. Other than that, there doesn't seem to be anything special about this one. Sony published 2 of the 4 Make My Video games on the Sega CD. Well, I guess they're not really games, are they? Anyway, they were responsible for the Crisscross and the Power Factory with CNC Music Factory titles. In these, you use extremely inept tools to try to edit videos to make someone happy. I can't believe that anyone thought this would be a good idea. Even the audio sucks because it's at a low bitrate and in mono. You'd definitely expect better from CD games.
Word up, I heard that, enough said. Now you in the house, so tell me, what's your scenario, baby?
Okay, warm it up. I want to see lots of switching stuff and Daddy Matt dribbling between his legs. I like the part where the girls chase him in their limo, but lose the fat guy with a zipper on his butt. And no effects.
This next game got a 30 out of 40 in Famitsu in Japan, and I saw one review on GameFAQs that gave it a 10. If I had to think about it, I'd probably give it a 5.
Extra inning!
This is Extra Innings on the Super Nintendo. This is another cutesy sports game. It plays okay, but your outfielders are very, very slow and also quite stupid. They all move in the same direction when you press on the D-pad. This isn't as good as, well, most other baseball titles. Here's Hook for the NES. You wander around the various levels collecting things. Once the game feels like you've collected enough things, Exit will flash in the upper right corner and you'll complete the stage once you find it. Then it's off to the next stage. If you try to exit before collecting enough things, you'll be denied. Your attack range sucks the big one. You may as well not even be able to attack. So it's best just to avoid touching all of the various enemies. This is generally pretty low tier for the console. There was also a Game Boy version of this one. It's basically the same game, only it's more difficult to tell where you're going because everything is cropped in so much. Good luck with that blind jumping. However, the enemies are somewhat easier to kill if you try. Later that year, Hook came out for the Super NES. This one is completely redesigned. It's also a far, far better game. Usually, you just need to make it to the end and sometimes defeat the boss. You can sometimes even fly, which is fun. The graphics are generally pretty nice. Later the next year, we got Hook on the Genesis. This certainly doesn't look as nice as the Super NES version, but it still looks good and the music is also pretty good. Overall, this version could be a lot worse. Hook also came to the Game Gear at that same time. It's also based on the Super NES version, just scaled back. It plays okay, but it is a bit too fast and slippery in comparison. Lastly, it came to the Sega CD. This is basically an enhanced version of the Genesis game. This one uses the real John Williams score from the movie. Because of that, this is the version that I'd rather play if I must play Hook. This here is Sewer Shark on the Sega CD. Through a deal with Sega, this was eventually bundled in with the Sega CD hardware. It's a crosshair shooter that also requires you to navigate extremely grainy tunnels while listening to some of the worst music on the platform. This would be a lot better without the music. I personally never liked this one, not even a little, but tons of other people do. Probably the same people that got it bundled in with their hardware and had nothing else to play. Sony had nothing to do with the port of this on the 3DO.
We got some hungry critters bearing 3, 9, or 12.
Here's Chuck Rock on the Super NES. I wanted this game so badly for a long time. Then I played it and the disappointment was great. You play as a caveman who has a very short-range attack with his gut and a rather large hitbox. It's all very European. I probably would have liked it more had there been more variety in the stages and music. Chuck Rock soon came to the Sega CD as well. This one both looks and sounds better than the SNES game, but not by much, and it plays pretty much the same. Sony didn't have anything to do with the version of this that came to the Genesis. However, they did bring it to the mighty Game Boy. It's definitely scaled down a lot here. In some places, it's very tough to see that there's something that you need to pick up because it blends in with the surroundings so well. Chuck appeared on a lot of platforms, but Sony only published these 3. Bram Stoker's Dracula for the SNES was based on the 1992 movie. It also marks Sony's first collaboration with Psygnosis, whom they would later purchase. Psygnosis farmed this one out to Traveler's Tales. It's a side-scrolling platformer, and it looks pretty damn good, visually. It's a bit loose, with large hitboxes and things that hit you out of nowhere, but it's mostly serviceable. There was also a Genesis version, once again developed by Traveler's Tales. It's largely the same game with some visual and sound differences, but it certainly holds its own against the Super Nintendo version. Then there's the Game Boy version, which was developed by Probe. They decided to make this one its own thing, but it's still based on the movie. It remains a side-scrolling platformer, but now it's much too fast for its own good with such limited visibility. It sometimes changes to night, and scary ghosts and other fiendish beings come out to hurt you. Still, it looks nice here and there for a Game Boy title. Too bad about the music though, ugh. An NES version also exists. This is like the Game Boy game, but in color with a much larger screen. And it's far better here simply because of those two things. You can actually tell when day turns into night on this one. Then there's the Master System version, which wasn't released in North America or Japan. Again, it's the same game, still developed by Probe, but even more colorful, and it plays a little bit better. It even has a voice on the title screen. Dracula. I think maybe Probe likes Sega a bit more. Dare I say that this version is almost fun? Actually, yeah, I think you can have a good time with this one. In my opinion, this is the best version of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Then there's the Game Gear version. This is the same as the Master System game, just cropped way in, dimmer, and blurrier. As you can guess, these things all make it worse. But hey, it got released in North America, so it's the best Bram Stoker's Dracula game released here anyway. Lastly, there's the Sega CD version. This one is also its own thing, yes, still based on the movie. This is a side-scrolling full-motion video platformer because it's, well, the Sega CD. I admire them for trying this concept. It doesn't work well, not at all, but it satiates the curiosity I would have had no one ever done this. It could have been a hair better had it allowed for some button remapping, but as it is, it's quite awkward to control and the game is very unforgiving. Sony also owned lots of movie studios back in the day and eventually folded them all into Sony Pictures or whatever they call it these days. And that made movie licensing deals rather easy. And here's another one. Cliffhanger on the Super Nintendo is based on the 1993 movie. This is a beat-em-up that feels like it was made by first-time programmers or maybe even first-time computer users. It's bad. The moves are all very stiff, there's not much animation, and it's just not fun. I've never been past this avalanche part, and I'm sure it's not even worth trying. This same game was released on the Genesis. It actually plays a little bit better here. That's not saying a lot though. It looks almost the same as the Super NES game, but sounds much worse. The avalanche stage here still sucks though. Then there's the Sega CD version. This one has a bunch of FMV from the movie. It also uses the movie's score for its in-game music, which is nice, but otherwise it's the Genesis version. Well, until you get to the avalanche stage, that is. Now we get a Sega CD exclusive avalanche level that's every bit as hard and every bit as unplayable, perhaps even more so. It's definitely technically impressive, but that's it. There's also a Game Boy version. This is a completely different game as now it's a side-scrolling platformer instead of a beat-em-up. Collect bags of money while fending off the local wildlife, all of which want you dead. You can burn some money at fires to restore some of your life. You can attack, but it's far too slow to rely on. I still think this is better than all of the 16-bit versions though. And they didn't forget the Game Gear, even though most people on the planet did. This is basically a color version of the Game Boy game. This certainly makes certain hazards easier to see, and overall it's just more pleasant to look at. Even the controls are a little bit better, and it's easier to fend off the evil wildlife. The game also runs a touch faster, which is nice. Definitely a good step up over the Game Boy. There was even an NES version. Again, basically it's the same game, but with a much wider field of view. This lets you see things around the stage much better, and the controls are pretty much on par with the Game Gear version. Overall, I'd say that this is my favorite version of Cliffhanger out of all of them, but make no mistake, it's still not, amazing or anything. Dear God, it's Last Action Hero on the Super NES. Yet another game based on a movie. This is a side-scrolling single-plane beat-em-up. There is absolutely nothing redeeming about this game. The enemies all have more reach and speed than you do, and your life bar drains fast. The enemies also take about 1,000 hits each to die. The level also never seems to end, and health refills are scarce. If you die, then it's back to the beginning for you. The visuals are horrendous, and the music is even worse. Then there's the Genesis version. Oh my god, this is so much better. The enemies die much faster, the balance is way more fair, and overall it's just more playable. Don't get me wrong, there's still nothing redeeming about this game though, it's just, a lot better in comparison. The graphics are slightly worse, and the game is still horrid, like it was made in a time frame of a month and a half. The music is pure crap, but it's way better than the music on the Super Nintendo game. Oh god, then there's the NES game. It's similar, just different. First of all, you should know that they got the attack and jump buttons backwards. Yeah, in 1993. You can't blame the developers though. Getting this correct would require having a finger on the pulse of the video games industry, and nobody has time for that. You defeat the final boss of the movie at the end of the first stage. But the movie was out of focus, so Danny falls asleep in class and dreams about how Hamlet should be. Now you play a Hamlet level as Arnold and it never ends. I mean, there is a quick Hamlet thing in the movie. And yes, the level probably does end, but there are so many better things that you could be doing with your life than playing this one. Oh, and the Game Boy version sucks too. It's a different game and you have to go and collect scraps of paper, presumably tickets. You also have to put out a bunch of fires. You bounce off of enemies as if they were made of rubber. The jump and action buttons are also backwards in this version because why would they be correct? Even in the very first level, you have to perform barely makeable jumps. If you miss, you gotta run all the way through the entire level to try again. The music is almost cool though. There's also a Game Gear version. This is the Game Boy game, just in color with simplified music. Other than that, it's exactly the same, right down to the ass-backwards controls. They were making a Sega CD version of Last Action Hero that got canceled. Probably because the movie bombed super hard, and I'm sure these other games did too. It was said to be based on the Amiga version here, which Sony had nothing to do with, but would have instead used FMV backgrounds like Bram Stoker's Dracula did. This Amiga version also sucks balls, by the way, and I'm not at all surprised. This one's called Gearworks, and it's for the Game Boy. It's a puzzle game where the idea is to place gears on the field to get the gear on the other side of the screen spinning. You gotta be careful to place them properly so that they don't seize up. It's also on the Game Gear, where the name is definitely more appropriate. It's the same, only it looks and sounds slightly better. It's definitely easier to see the outline of a potential gear placement when it changes color. If you like puzzle games that nobody talks about, give it a try. Yay, it's Ground Zero Texas for the Mega CD. That's right, Mega CD. Sony only handled publishing duties for this one outside of North America, whereas it was released by Sega themselves in North America for the Sega CD. This is your typical FMV game where you need to shoot down alien bad guys who are invading a town. Naturally, you have cameras set up all over the place as well as guns. There are lots of people and situations to watch as well. This one's really not as bad as it sounds. It's better than, say, Double Switch, at least in my opinion. It's ESPN Speed World for the Super Nintendo. This is Sony's first licensed game featuring the much ballyhooed ESPN Sports television channel, which I've never watched. This is a stock car racing game, and dear Lord, this looks exceedingly simple. Where is the bottom quarter of the screen? Why is it gone? As a game, it's mediocre at best. I think most of the memory was spent on the excellent voice samples.
The driver's all-around ability will be tested today on this very demanding road course.
It's also on the Genesis. The graphics look about the same. It's still not a particularly attractive looking game though. But hey, at least it fills the screen. Seriously, what the hell, Super Nintendo? And as a game, it's once again pretty mediocre. The voices are mostly here and they sound great, but not quite as good as the Super NES.
The driver's all-around ability will be tested today on this very demanding road course.
I expected to very much dislike this next game. I mean, it started out as a computer game, it's in the puzzle genre, it has next to no music, bleh. But I was pleasantly surprised. This is Super Morph on the Super Nintendo. This was only released in the European region. This is the console port of an Amiga game, and Sony published this version. It's a puzzle game where you are a ball. You have to collect the cog in the level and then make it to the exit. You can transform or morph into one of 4 different modes, each of which have their own abilities. For example, the red ball is bouncy, the blue ball acts like liquid, the black ball is heavy and can smash things, and the cloud can float. You only have a limited number of transforms, so you need to use them wisely. There are a lot of levels in this one. Now, I normally don't care much for puzzle games, but I played this one a lot longer than I expected to. It's actually pretty fun. The only thing that would make this a little better is if it had some catchy music while playing. This game honestly should have been released everywhere else. Play it if you can. This is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for the Super NES. Yes, based on the movie. It's a side-scrolling action game with some puzzle elements. And the puzzle elements are basically crafting items. The whole game definitely takes a bit of getting used to. Compared to Last Action Hero, which was also developed by Bit Studios, this feels like a breath of fresh air and like it's an actual 16-bit game, but still far from being a classic of any kind. The Genesis version is very similar, just toned down visually and audibly. I actually prefer the way the Genesis handles the graphics in the second level, because you can see more of the stage when you have your torch, and that makes it more pleasant to play. There's also a version on the Sega CD developed by Psygnosis. This one is an adventure game, and it's a far better title. However, there are some awkward one-on-one fighting scenes as well. You can only ever buy this game bundled with Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is a shame because honestly, this game deserved its own standalone release. It's definitely more enjoyable than the movie. Up next is Equinox on the Super NES. As you can probably tell by the title and also the isometric viewpoint, this is a sequel to Solstice. It plays in a very similar manner, and again, it helps if you hold the controller diagonally. You get a weapon much earlier in this game, and that makes it easier to get into. There's also an exciting overworld map made out of authentic Mode 7. There are creatures roaming around out here, and if you touch them, you'll get a close-up battle. You can also enter different parts of the various dungeons below to get everywhere you need to go. The music is still good, but it's much more atmospheric this time, as it isn't always playing. And obviously, the visuals have taken a big step up. I like this one a lot more than the first, and I definitely recommend it. Here's Sky Blazer on the Super NES. This side-scrolling action game is an evolution of Hook in many ways. The game runs faster, you have more moves, and you can even earn more throughout the game. The controls feel a touch slippery at first, but you will get used to them. A lot of the stages here feel really tough the first time you try them, but they're the kind where you want to keep trying until you get it right. At least most of them. That's always the mark of a good game. Speaking of which, there are many different styles of stages here. You even get to experience some Mode 7 so that you feel like you got your money's worth. The graphics in this one are excellent, with lots of bold and bright colors and well-drawn detail. The sound quality is also pretty good, though the music won't blow you away or anything. I suggest that you give it a try because well, you might like it. Heck yeah, it's another ESPN game. This time it's ESPN Baseball Tonight for the Super Nintendo. While the animation is super fluid, it's just a rather average game of baseball. When the ball is hit, the camera doesn't change, so fielding is awkward. And you always have to throw the ball back to the pitcher or the game just sits there and waits for you. Other than the aforementioned animation, the visuals here are rather bland, and the same can be said about the audio. It's also on the Genesis. It looks almost exactly the same, and it certainly plays the same. But other than the music, the sound here might actually be better than the Super NES version. There was actually a Sega CD port as well. This is just like the Genesis game, except with some grainy FMVs here and there and more crowd noise during the game. There was also a DOS version released by Sony.
Out of there!
Here's The Misadventures of Flink on the Mega Drive, developed by Psygnosis. Sony shared distribution duties with Psygnosis themselves in Europe and Australia. This plays similar to Lomax on the PlayStation, just, well, you know, not as good. That's really the best way I can describe it since I played Lomax first. This is still a pretty good game though. There's a magic using aspect that I never really paid attention to in this one, as I just want a platform. The graphics are outstanding, but the sound and music, yeah, not so much. There was a Sega CD port released in North America by Vic Tokai, which of course fixes the music issue, adds some content, and also runs a bit faster and smoother. This game is optimized for PAL consoles, so don't try to import it for your Genesis or you'll get this. And I don't think you want this. As a result of the slower refresh rate, it is a bit of a slog to play compared to the Sega CD game. It also came out on the short-lived Amiga CD32 console. That's right, Sony, makers of the mighty PlayStation line of consoles, published a game for the CD32. It uses the same CD audio tracks as the Sega CD port, and it looks mostly identical except there are fewer layers of parallax scrolling and there's overall less on the screen at a time. Also, for some reason, the foreground layer gets completely cut off at the top. What's going on with that? Stupid Amiga. It also runs at 30 frames per second instead of 60 like the Sega CD version. But at least it plays at the same speed as the Sega CD version, so that's good. This is Sensible Soccer for the Mega Drive. They absolutely love this game more than anything across the pond. It doesn't take much to impress them, I guess, which explains a lot of their games. Yeah, I went there. In their defense, though, the gameplay is fast and generally pretty good. The graphics are entirely 8-bit, however. There's also a Sensible Soccer International Edition. It's the same, except international. That's awesome! Naturally, it was also released on the Master System, which was very popular in Europe. And look at that, it looks almost identical to its 16-bit brothers. It also plays just as well. The only thing sacrificed is the sound. It's much more simple here. The Game Gear version is the same. Well, except that it's really cropped in since the screen on this thing is smaller. The Game Boy version is also similar. This one puts a large arrow above the player that you're controlling, and the game as a whole plays much more slowly. This was also on tons of computers and the like over there, and the series has many different entries. I'm just surprised that they allowed it to be called soccer and not football. I guess the popularity of this game over there settles that debate. This did get released in North America on the Sega CD, where it's known as Championship Soccer 94. This version gives you some CD music as well as crowd noise straight off of the disc. You'll still need a telescope to see the tiny players though. It also showed up on the Super Nintendo as Championship Soccer 94. This same version of course was called Sensible Soccer in Europe. This feels like a slightly more polished version than all of the others. While the players are all still very microscopic, it does feature some mind-blowing Mode 7 scaling when a goal is scored to let you know that yes, this is indeed the future. Here's Three Ninjas Kick Back on the Super NES. This is based on a kid's movie that I never saw. It's an action platformer that I've never much cared for. It's by Malibu Interactive, so you know the balance is going to be all wonky, and it is. You have a variety of moves, but life refills are few and far between. Same goes for the Genesis game. It's a little brighter without the fog overlay, so things are easier to see, and that's much appreciated. I like how the kid yells, "Yeah!" when he gets hurt, like he's excited to be losing health from his life bar. Maybe he's a masochist. But other than that, the game is the same. There's also a Sega CD version. The Super NES and Genesis both had musical sound quality that was not healthy for your ears. This version fixes that. It also adds some full motion video of the Mr. Miyagi wannabe character from the movie. I guess he's from the movie. Lastly, it adds some stages that actually take advantage of the Sega CD's special scaling and rotation features. These are really cool, but it's just not worth playing through the normal game to get to them. Do you remember ESPN Extreme games on the PlayStation? There are like a couple of them. I really liked those, at least, for what they were at the time. But before they got there, Sony had to make all of these other ESPN games, and they're not very extreme. It's ESPN National Hockey Night for the Super NES. As you may have guessed from the title, this is a hockey game. It's serviceable, certainly not bad, though the controls do feel a bit slippery, like I'm on ice. You done laughing yet? Okay, let's move on. What's cool about this one is that you can play from a side view or a Mode 7 view, which you can switch back and forth at any time, though you do have to navigate a menu. Like I said, this one's not bad, but it's not as good as EA's hockey games of the same time period. It came to the Genesis as well. This again is a very playable game, but it can't touch EA's hockey games on the same console. Sadly, the stupid Genesis can't do Mode 7, so we get a straight-up overhead view instead, just like EA's NHL games. So, do you prefer this view, or do you like the Mode 7 better? I think I like the Mode 7 better. Of course, it also saw a release on the Sega CD. It's the Genesis version, but here we get some FMV of those super exciting ESPN guys and a few other video scenes. And the game has better ambient audio thanks to the CD. It's ESPN Sunday Night NFL on the Super Nintendo. 2 ESPN games in a row? That's right, GameSack is all about providing pure bliss to its viewers, and it doesn't get much more blissful than ESPN. The Super NES didn't get as many football games as the Genesis, and they were generally worse. This one doesn't do much to stand out against those. However, it does have a field made out of Mode 7. It also has some flicker from time to time. The play selection screen is a bit rough for me, as I never remember exactly where each button is since they labeled them in backwards order because Nintendo. My brain only runs at 3.58 MHz, so that's asking a lot. Anyway, you have to hold the button down for a bit and then let it go to throw the ball, which is kind of weird. How about the Genesis version? Well, I had an easier time with the ABC play selection screen since my simple brain can handle that. The graphics do their best to imitate Mode 7, but it's not real Mode 7. Maybe it's Astro Mode 7? You know, like AstroTurf? Yeah, that was painfully bad. I apologize.
Complete!
The Sega CD version of this one fares the same as their hockey game did. It's exactly like the Genesis, just with some FMV here and there, especially the ESPN ninnies. And you get better ambient audio. Overall, a slightly below average bunch of football games.
Complete!
Super Bomberman on the Super NES was also handled by Sony, but only in Europe. This is your typical Bomberman game, so you know it's good. Drop bombs to blow up obstacles. Defeat all of the enemies and then find the exit to end the stage. The progression in the story mode is a little slow with this one, but if you have the patience, it can be fun. If you have a multi-tap, then you can play against 3 friends simultaneously in battle mode. The graphics look nice, but they don't change very often, at least in single-player mode. I'd recommend pretty much any of the later Bomberman games over this one, but this is still good. It's Jeopardy for the Sega CD. If you've ever seen the TV game show, then you know what this is. It uses lots of full motion video of Alex Trebek and the contestants. I chose this chick in the yellow because she's kind of cute in an early 90s sort of way. Typing in your answers with the controller isn't very fun, but at least there isn't a time limit doing it. Oh wait, there is! Oh man, this is stressful. Since I'm generally of very low intelligence and couldn't even make it past 2nd grade, I'm not very good at this game. GameTech handled the cartridge versions of this one.
Wrong.
Sony also did the Sega CD entry of Wheel of Fortune. Again, this is based on a TV game show that you may be familiar with. Sony even brought over the same chick in yellow from Jeopardy! Either she never changes clothes or she got to play 2 TV game shows in a single day. There's a lot of full motion video of Vanna White, but Pat Sajak wanted too much money to appear. That's why Alex Trebek will always be a true hero. He's not too good to be on the Sega CD. This one uses the hardware rotation features on the wheel, which your entire family will surely appreciate. GameTech did the cartridge versions of this one as well.
That's correct.
Here's Mickey Mania on the Genesis, developed by Traveler's Tales. This game is a celebration of the history of Mickey Mouse, and it does that job very well, with each level representing different eras of Mickey. Like all Traveler's Tales games of this era, it's quite impressive technically, but it leaves something to be desired when it comes to gameplay and level design. The graphics are phenomenal, as is the animation, but anything and everything can and will hurt you and your planet-sized hitbox. One of my least favorite things about this one is that the screen fades to black immediately when you die, so you can't register exactly what happened. It's so jarring and unpleasant. Still, this game is quite fun otherwise and has lots of different levels. A Super Nintendo port also happened. This was also done by Traveler's Tales, but not the same team. It's inferior to the Genesis version in almost every way. It has fewer Mickey voices, it's missing a level, it has tons of loading times, I swear it doesn't even play as smoothly, and the music doesn't even sound quite as good. That said, this is still a good game. The Sega CD port is by far the best version. It's the Genesis game, but with CD quality music and a ton more Mickey voices. It also has the exhilarating load times from the Super Nintendo game, so you get the best of both worlds. However, this one doesn't load as often. This was the version of Mickey Mania that I played first, so it's tough for me to play the slightly more limited cartridge versions. I personally feel that this version is the best game that Traveler's Tales ever made, even though it can't touch Castle of Illusion.
Wow, what a bug! Kinda heavy.
This is Super Battle Tank 2 for the Super NES. Sony handled publishing duties in Europe. This game was made by the celebrated game designer Gary Kitchen, but honestly there's not much to it. Just look at the map and roam around to the various targets, destroy them, and then move on to the next one. I do accidentally keep calling up the map when I mean to fire since they put the function on the B button, which is the primary button and also the easiest one to press on the pad. Although there's not a whole lot of excitement here, it could certainly be much worse. Here's No Escape for the Super Nintendo. It's based on a 1994 movie that I've never seen. Actually, I don't think very many people have seen it. I've never heard anyone mention it, ever. This game starts off by having people relentlessly chase you, and it's super frustrating right in level 1. A large part of that is the super slow and unresponsive controls that you don't have a chance to get used to, but you will get the hang of it eventually. Once you get past that, you can fight a boss. You can also buy items and stuff. Then you can combine them in a manner which reminds me of the cartridge versions of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Same developer. The controls are similar to Prince of Persia in many respects. there was a Genesis version too. It's pretty much the same, only it looks a lot worse visually. Oh hey, it's Winston! I do think this could be a good game, but the crafting and building stuff is something I was never able to get into outside of Breath of the Wild, and that is a huge part of this game. It does have its fans though, so maybe give it a go. This is Johnny Mnemonic.
It's Mnemonic.
It was on PC and Mac and planned and canceled for the Sega CD. This is the Sega CD prototype because that's the easiest version for me to obtain and play. It's an FMV game and you play as the title character, but sadly not Keanu himself. But it does have some recognizable faces, like this guy. Oh, and Chosen from Karate Kid 2. I'm amazed I could recognize them with video quality this bad. It plays similar to Fox Hunt on the PlayStation. Move Johnny around and have him look at things, which causes him to get all blitzed out of his mind, I guess. It's a bit of a guessing game what you need to do in each scenario. It could be worse, but it could also be a hell of a lot better.
Johnny, how are you, mate? Beijing went down bad, Ralphie. You never said anything about Yakuza.
Oh, must have slipped my mind. Tell me you have got the data.
Oh, I got it, Ralphie.
Here's Eastern Mind, Lost Souls of Tong Nao. It was available for Windows 3.1 and Mac OS 7 through 9. It's a very strange point-and-click adventure from the mind of Osamu Sato. He's a Japanese artist who would later go on to helm LSD Dream Simulator on the PlayStation, another weird one. This is not something you see every day. If you really want to trip some balls, well, it's definitely worth giving a shot. If you can run it, that is. This is ESPN Hangtime 95 for the Sega CD. It's a 2-on-2 basketball game, as you can see. Amazingly, it's exclusive to the Sega CD and not ported everywhere like Sony did with all of their other sports games, well, most of them. As a result, it's built specifically for the hardware and uses the unit scaling abilities for the floor and stuff. It doesn't use them well, mind you, but points for trying. As a game, it's not that good, and I'd recommend any version of NBA Jam over this one. Sony also published the Ultraverse Prime and Microcosm bundle for the Sega CD. This includes 2 games. Microcosm, which is an FMV shooter where you're shrunk down and inserted into someone's butthole to blast down various things that the individual put up there that most definitely should not be up there. Interestingly, Sony did not handle the standalone release of this game on the same system. Then there's Prime, which is a half-assed attempt at a beat-em-up. You could only get it in this bundle. This one has some potential, but it feels like they just didn't want to put a ton of effort into it. There's nothing noteworthy here at all. It doesn't even take up the whole screen. How weak. And finally, it's Flashback for the Super Nintendo. Sony published only this version and only in PAL regions. You play as a dude with amnesia, and you need to plan what button you press 5 to 10 seconds in advance because this is not a responsive game. It has some polygon-looking cutscenes, but they're really slow on this console. The regular game plays well enough though, I mean for Flashback. This game actually has a lot of fans. And there you go, that's Sony Imagesoft for you. It's kind of easy to see why a lot of people doubted what Sony could bring to the table when they announced their own hardware platform. But boy, oh boy, did they step up. Anyway, what do you think of Sony's journey from third party to platform maker? Let me know. In the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack. I am out of here. Wait, no, I gotta make an end sketch. Ah yes, Mickey Mania, the timeless adventures of Mickey Mouse. You know, this might be my third, fourth, or heck, maybe even my fifth favorite Mickey game. From 1993. Wow, this game's over 20 years old. Wait a minute. 1990. This game's over 30 years old! Whoa. Man, that makes me feel old. Well, how about this? Grand Theft Auto Vice City. This is a lot newer. Let's see, it's from 2002. Dear God, Grand Theft Auto Vice City is over 20 years old!